Hello my crochet friends, this is Sarah from Ned and Mimi, and in this video we are going to crochet the Azalea Batwing sweater. Now this sweater is lightweight but still comfy and cozy, and I absolutely love the braided puff stitch feature along the sleeves and the neckline. I really think it adds a little something extra to the sweater. So the crochet pattern is written for 9 sizes from extra small up to 5X, and I have linked the pattern below because you will definitely want to have that to hand to help you keep track of the stitch counts and row counts for the size that you are making. In this video I am going to be making the small size, so without further ado let's get crocheting. So before we get started, let's just have a quick look at the supplies that we're going to need. So for my sweater I used Rico Baby Classic DK, which is a weight 3 or a lightweight DK yarn, and this yarn is a blend of nylon and acrylic, and it's super soft and washable, most importantly. Now interestingly, the recommended hook or knitting needle size for this yarn is a 3.5 or a 4mm hook, and I'm actually going to use a 5mm hook for my sweater, and there are 2 reasons for this. So number one, when I am making any garments, I like them to have a really good drape, and one way to get this, especially if you are a tight crocheter like me, is to use a slightly larger hook than you normally would for the particular yarn. So that's one reason, and the second reason is that the ribbing stitch pattern that we're going to use works better if you have a slightly larger hook. So the amount of yarn that you need will differ depending on the size that you are making, and I have listed the yardage for each size below, so do check that out before you start making your sweater. Before we get started crocheting, I'm just going to take a minute to show you how we're going to make this sweater. So the sweater is made from identical front and back panels. So the good news is, once you have mastered one size, all you need to do is make a second. So the sweater is crocheted from the bottom up. So we're going to start with a strip of ribbing here, worked lengthways, and then we'll work the first row of the body into the edge of the ribbing. So then we will work a section of even half double crochet rows, and followed by our increase rows here to create the batwing shape, and the increases on the other side are exactly the same. So once we have worked all of our increases, we're going to work the puff stitch section up here at the top. So this section consists of 2 puff stitch rows followed by 2 half double crochet rows, then 2 more puff stitches, 2 half double crochet, and 2 more puff stitches at the top. And then once we have made both panels, we are going to seam them at the shoulders here. So I used a mattress stitch seam, and after that we're going to work the sleeve trim directly into the edge of both panels. Once that is done, the final step is to seam the sides along here. And that is it. So the construction of the sweater is pretty simple. So let's just go ahead now and get started on the bottom trim. Let's get started with our ribbing. So we're going to start with a slip knot and chain 9. So try not to make these chains too tight. Okay, so now we're going to work a stitch called the yarn over slip stitch. So it's a variation on the slip stitch, and it's going to give us that lovely knit purl look ribbing. So to make this stitch, we're going to yarn over, then we're going to skip the first chain, insert the hook into the second chain, yarn over and pull up a loop. And now we're not going to yarn over again, we are just going to pull through those remaining 2 loops. So let's do another one of those. So yarn over, insert our hook into the next chain, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then keep pulling all the way through. So you might notice that instead of keeping my hook angled towards me, I am tilting it away from me, so rotating it away as I pull through those 2 loops. and that makes these stitches much easier. And the other thing that you want to try and do as you work these stitches is to keep your tension nice and loose. So it might feel like your loops are just too big and your tension is too loose, but I promise you with this stitch pattern there's no such thing as too loose. Okay, so for our first row we have 8 stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's go straight on to row 2. So we'll chain 1 and turn, and now we're going to work that same yarn over slip stitch again, except we're going to work it into the back loop of the previous row. Okay, so just the back loop only. So we yarn over, insert that hook into the back loop, yarn over and pull up a loop, and continue to pull all the way through. And let's continue with that all the way along. Now sometimes the last stitch of the row can be a little tricky to find that back loop. So just keeping your stitches nice and loose will help with that as well. Okay, so that's our second row done. Now you can kind of see that knit look pattern starting to form, but it will become a lot more clear as we work a few more rows. So let me just go ahead and work a few more so that you can see what our ribbing is going to look like. So you can see here that this one is a little bit trickier. So we just find that back loop and complete the stitch as normal. Okay, I'm just going to work a few more quickly. Alrighty, so I've just worked a few more rows of the ribbing, and you can see already that we have our lovely knit purl look ribbing starting to take shape. So we're just going to proceed by repeating that same row all the way along until we have worked the right number of ribbing for the size that we are making. So for my size that I'm crocheting today, I am going to work 68 rows of this ribbing. So I will pause the video now and then come back in when I have worked my 68 rows. Okay, so I have finished working my ribbing. I have a total of 68 rows, and if you are finding it tricky to figure out your row count here, your tail here from the starting chain is going to be on the opposite corner to where you finish up. Okay, so your tail is down here and you're going to finish up here. So let's get straight in to the body of the sweater. So we're going to chain 1 and turn, and now I am going to just half double crochet evenly along the edge of the ribbing. I am trying to work 1 stitch for each row of ribbing. So you don't need to worry too much about where you place your stitches, but just try to work as neatly as you can. And the main thing is that you end up with the same number of stitches as what you had in your ribbing rows. So in the pattern it will list the number of stitches that you should have for each size. So for my size, I want 68 stitches in this row because I had 68 rows of ribbing. Okay, so I have just completed that half double crochet row into the edge, and it is a good idea to stop here and just count your stitches again and make sure that you actually do have the number that you require, because if you need to squeeze in an extra stitch here at the end, or if you need to take one away, this is the place to do it and not later on. So I am going to chain one and turn, and for all of these half double crochet rows, the turning chain does not count as a stitch. So I'm going to half double crochet in the first stitch and then in each stitch across for the entire row. Okay, so that's row 2 done, another row of half double crochet, and what we're going to do from this point on is just work some more even rows of simple half double crochet stitches. So for the size that I am making, I want to crochet a total of 12 half double crochet rows. So I've already done 2 and I'm going to need to crochet another 10. So do check the pattern and make sure that you are working the correct number of rows for the size that you are making. So I'm going to go ahead and begin my even rows now, and then I will come back into the video to start the increase sections. Okay, so I have finished working my 12 even rows of half double crochet, and now I'm ready to start increasing. So we're going to increase evenly on both sides, so we're going to increase by the same amount on the left side and the right side. And we are going to work our increases in 2 sections. So with the first section, we're going to increase 1 stitch on the left side and 1 stitch on the right. And then in the second increase section, we're going to do double increases. So we'll increase by 2 stitches at the start of the row and 2 stitches at the end. And this is going to help us a lot with the sleeve shaping as we get up towards the top of the sweater. And this will all make a lot more sense once you actually start working it. So let's go ahead now and start our first increase section, which is to increase every row. All right, so our first increase is very simple. We're just going to chain 1 and turn, and then my increase is simply 2 half double crochets in the first stitch, and that's the increase done. So now I'm just going to half double crochet all the way along until I come to the final stitch, and then I will work my second increase. Okay, so I am almost at the end of the row, and I'm just going to make my second increase now. So I am going to work a half double crochet into that last stitch, and then I'm actually going to finish the increase with a double crochet. So the reason for this is because the chain 1 at the start of the half double crochet rows does not count as a stitch. Sometimes that chain 1 can just tug a little bit on the edges of the rows. And what I found when I started increasing using only half double crochets was that it curved the edge a little bit. So to get around that, I decided to balance it out by doing a half double crochet increase at the start of the row and then the double crochet increase at the end of the row. And that worked out much, much better. So for the rest of this section, we just need to repeat that same increase row. So for the size that I'm making, I need to work a total of 22 increase rows. So do check the pattern and make sure that you are working the correct number of rows for the size that you are making. So I'm going to go ahead now and work those increase rows, and then I will come back into the video for the second increase section, which is the double increases. Alrighty, so I have finished working the increase rows where I was increasing every row, and you can see how the shaping is starting to form. So we have our even rows, then increases on every row, and now what we're going to do is do double increases for the next number of rows, and that's just going to shape the sleeve section. Okay, so as always, I'm going to chain 1 and turn my work. And I'm going to begin this row with an increase in the first stitch and an increase in the second stitch. So we will work 2 half double crochets in the first stitch and 2 half double crochets in the second stitch. Okay, so that's 2 increases done. And now, as with the previous rows, I am just going to half double crochet all the way along to the end of the row until I have 2 stitches left, and then I'm going to work my 2 increases there as well. Okay, so I'm almost at the end of this row. So I'm going to stop here when I still have 2 stitches left. Now I'm going to work my first increase on this side in that second last stitch. So that's 2 half double crochets to do that increase. And then for my second increase on this side, I'm going to work 2 double crochets. So the same type of pattern as what we had for the single increase rows. Just that this time there's going to be 2 double crochets. Okay, so that's our double increase done on both sides. And as with the previous section, we just need to repeat this same row for the correct number of times for the size that we're making. So again, the number of repeats will differ depending on the size that you're making, so do check the pattern and make sure that you're working the correct number of double increase rows. So I'm just going to continue on, and then we will come to the final sleeve section and the puff stitches. Okay, so I have just finished all of my increase rows with double increases, so 2 on each side, and the other side is identical. And now I am ready to go on to the sleeve section. So the first couple of rows of the sleeve are very easy. They're just going to be solid half double crochet rows. And for the size that I'm making, I need to work 2 of these rows. But again, as always, check the pattern and just make sure that you are working the correct number of even half double crochet rows for the size that you're making. So I am going to chain 1 and then just half double crochet in each stitch across, and just repeat that one more time then. So I'll just pause the video now and then come back in when we are ready to begin the puff stitch section. Okay, so I have just finished working my 2 even half double crochet rows, and now we are finally ready to go on to the puff stitch section. So we're just going to turn our work and begin the puff stitches. So to begin this row, we are going to chain 3, and this chain 3 counts as 1 double crochet. So that means that we're not going to work into this first stitch, and then for the puff stitch pattern we're going to skip the second stitch, and then we're going to work a double crochet into the third stitch. And now we're ready to work our first puff stitch, and we're going to work that stitch into this second skipped half double crochet here, and we're going to work it around the double crochet, so that double crochet is going to be hidden inside the puff stitch. So let's yarn over, insert our hook into that skipped stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. We want to pull up the loop to the height of the current row, so about the height of a double crochet. And now we're just going to repeat that same step 4 more times. So 5 loops pulled up in total for our puff stitch. And then we'll just yarn over and gently pull through. So that bit can be a little bit tricky, but it gets easier with practice. And then to secure the top of the puff stitch, we're just going to chain 1. So this chain 1 does not count as a stitch, but it's really just there to keep that puff stitch in place. So continuing on, we need to skip the next stitch and then work a half double crochet in the next one. Sorry, double crochet I should have said there. So used to saying half double crochet. So double crochet in the next stitch, and then again working back over that double crochet and working a puff stitch in the skipped stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. yarn over and pull through and secure it with the chain. And that is our pattern for the entire row. So we skip a stitch, double crochet, and then puff stitch in the skip stitch. Alright, so I'm just going to continue on with that pattern all the way along this row, and you will find that these puff stitches really eat up yarn, so you will probably notice a dramatic increase in your yarn usage as you work these puff stitch rows, but I do think it's worth it in the end for the lovely braided effect that you're going to get. So let's just continue on, skip a stitch, double crochet, puff stitch. So I'm going to continue on with that pattern all the way across the row. Okay, so I am nearly at the end of this row, and it does take a while. So those puff stitches are slow, but I tried to just lean into it and accept the fact that it was going to take quite long to complete one row and just try to enjoy the process. So here we are. I have one half double crochet left to work into. So I'm just going to do a double crochet in that stitch, and I'm going to turn my work to begin the next puff stitch row, and this is the one that is going to create the braid pattern for us. All right, so to begin this row, as with the previous one, I'm going to chain 3, and that counts as one double crochet. Now, what I'm going to do is skip this puff stitch and skip the double crochet that is enclosed in that puff stitch, and I'm going to work a double crochet into this space. So it's kind of the chain 1 space that seals off the top of the puff stitch. Now, if you're finding this a little bit tricky, you can always mark this space just after you make it, and then when you come to do this step, it'll be much easier. So anyway, we have done our chain 3, then we're going to do double crochet into that space, and now what we're going to do is work our puff stitch back into this space at the start of the row. So again, this is the chain 1 that enclosed the final puff stitch of the previous row, and we're just going to work a puff stitch into that space. So this is really only a little bit tricky the first few times you do it, and once you have done a few of them in the row, it'll become very, very straightforward. So I think that's 4 and 5. All right, so that's my first puff stitch done, and just close it off with the chain. So again, we're going to skip this next space and do a double crochet into the next one. So double crochet, and then working back over that, we'll do our puff stitch into the skipped space. And that is the repeat for the entire row. So I'm going to continue along with that now, and then I will come back into the video to show you how we are going to finish off this second puff stitch row. Okay, so I'm almost at the end of this second puff stitch row. So to finish off the row, I'm going to work one final double crochet and puff stitch. So my last double crochet is just going to go in this chain 3 space here, so in the turning chain space. So we'll just work that in there, and then work the last puff stitch in the space that we just skipped. close it with a chain, and then I'm going to work the very last double crochet of the row in the top of this turning chain 3 here. So I have a double crochet in the chain space and then the final stitch in the top of the turning chain, and that finishes off the row nicely. Now, before I go on to the next row, which is just going to be half double crochets, I'm just going to take some stitch markers and I'm going to mark the double crochets that are sort of enclosed in these puff stitches, and I'm just going to do 2 of them because the pattern will become pretty obvious after that. So basically we had our last double crochet of the row, then we had the chain 1, then this is the puff stitch, this is the start of the puff stitch, and then this is the double crochet. So I'm going to mark that one, and let's just go on one more repeat of that. So this is the chain from the puff stitch, this is the actual puff stitch, and then this is the double crochet. Okay, so this is just going to make the next row a little bit easier if you're confused about where exactly, what stitches you actually need to work in for the next row. And this helps me a lot. So anytime that I kind of lose a stitch or can't figure out where exactly I need to make a stitch, I use stitch markers. Okay, so on to the next row. So I'm just going to turn my work. There's a lot of it now. And I am going to chain 1 and then half double crochet in the first stitch. So that's the last stitch of the previous row. So then what I'm going to do is work another half double crochet in this chain 1 space. So that chain that finished off the puff stitch, that's where I'm going to work my next half double crochet. Now I'm going to skip over the puff stitch, which is this one actually, because otherwise I would end up with 3 stitches for every puff, and I actually just want 2 stitches for every puff because that's the count that we're going for. So remember that chain 1 at the end of the puff stitches does not count as a stitch. So we have done our 2 half double crochets here. I'm just going to take out this stitch marker. I'm going to do a half double crochet in that double crochet and then a half double crochet in the chain 1 space again. Okay, and again, let's just take out that stitch marker, half double crochet in the double crochet and half double crochet in the chain 1 space. All right, so after having done that a few times, it's going to be pretty obvious what you need to do for the rest of the row. So let's just take note here again. So this is our puff stitch, this is our double crochet. And the chain space, skip the puff stitch, work into the double crochet and the chain space. Again, skip the puff stitch, work into the double crochet. So I know the double crochet is a little bit tricky. It's a bit tricky to find the top of it because it is hidden inside that puff stitch. But after a few of them, it's just going to be second nature. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of how that row is going to look. And that's all we're going to do. We're just going to repeat that all the way across the entire row, and then the next row is going to be very easy. It's just going to be a simple half double crochet row. So what I'm going to do is work to the end of this row and just quickly show you how to finish off the row, and then I will work another half double crochet row. Alrighty, so I'm just at the end of this half double crochet row, so you can see that we have our nice little pairs of half double crochet all the way along the row, and we're just going to finish off the row in exactly the same way. So we're going to do a half double crochet in the double crochet and then finish with a half double crochet in the top of that turning chain 3. And that's the end of that row. So the next row is super simple. We are just going to chain 1 and turn and then half double crochet all the way along. So I'll just do that super quickly. Okay, so I have just finished that half double crochet row and I have turned my work so that I'm looking at the right side, and the rest of this panel is very easy actually. So what we're going to do is repeat these 2 puff rows, then repeat these 2 half double crochet rows, then repeat the puff again, and finally work 1 half double crochet row, so just exactly like this one. And that's it. So we're going to end up with 3 puff braids separated by 2 rows of half double crochet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work my repeats, and then I will come back into the video for the seaming of the shoulders and to show you what the next steps are. Okay, so it feels like I have been working puff stitches for about 10 years, but I have to say I am really thrilled with the effect, and I absolutely love the look of the top of this sweater. So just as a quick recap, we had our puff stitch rows, 2 half double crochet rows, puff stitch, half double crochet, puff stitch, and then at the top remembering that we just need to work 1 half double crochet. And the reason is that when we seam the shoulders on the front and the back, there will be 1 row, and then when we seam it together, that will kind of join the 2 rows, so we'll get the same interval in between the puff stitches. So what I'm actually going to do next is block this panel, and it's really just to kind of straighten up the curve here and just shape it a little bit and just stretch out the little bits that need stretching. And also at this point, if you find that your panel is measuring slightly different to the one of the pattern, it's a good opportunity to just block it and sort out any of those issues. So while that is being blocked, I'm going to go ahead and start the second panel and then block that one also. And then when I finished with the 2 of them, I will show you how we are going to just seam at the shoulders to create the neckline and finally work the sleeves. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with the blocking and the making of the second panel, and I will see you back in the video very soon. Okay, and we're back. So I have blocked my sweater panel. So I have kind of ironed out any of the little kinks that were happening here at the side and just smoothed the whole thing out, and it looks great. And now we are ready to start seaming the shoulders. So right now I am looking at the right side of my panel, and if you're a bit confused about which is the right side and which is the wrong side, your tail at the end is going to be up here on the left. So that's how you'll know that you're looking at the right side. And the other way you can tell is to come back to the first lot of puff stitches, and you should see that the first puff stitch is kind of angling towards the right. So that's also how you'll know that it's the right side. And the last thing that I want to point out here is that I have just added some stitch markers, and these are to mark the neckline. So when we seam the shoulders, we're going to be seaming on each side up until this midpoint of the neckline. So I am just going to flip this one around actually to here, and then I'm going to grab my other panel that I have also made. So if only it was that easy in real life, but here is the other one. And let's just make sure that I'm looking at the right side here. So no, I am not. So we're going to lay the panels flat like this so that the right sides are both facing up, and we're just going to align the stitch markers here for the neckline. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is begin on this side. So we'll just slide this all the way over, and then using this long tail, and I have a matching one on the opposite side. So using this long tail, I'm just going to seam with the mattress stitch all the way along to the stitch markers. And then to really reinforce the seam, I'm going to flip it over and do a whip stitch along the inside. So I'll show you all that now. Okay, so let's get on with our seaming. So I have just threaded my yarn needle, and I'm going to use the long tail that we left here on this side, and I'm just going to start off with securing this edge, and now I'm going to begin working my mattress stitch all the way across. Okay, so this stitch is really easy, and it's going to give a near seamless finish to the shoulders, which I just love. So what I'm going to do is take my needle, and then I'm going to go in and out along the top of the first and second stitch. Now my tail is a little bit too long, so it's a small bit awkward, but so we're just going to do that loosely, and then we're going to come back and do the same thing on the opposite side. So this is the first stitch, so in and out there, between the top of the first and second stitch. Okay, so they're going to kind of cross over and back, and we just keep repeating that a few more times. Okay, so now I'm just going to hold my two edges here and pull the yarn very gently, and that will just bring the stitches together. And that's all there is to it. So we're just going to keep going, weaving the needle in and out along the tops of the stitches of each panel. And then after every sort of 5 or 6 stitches, just give a gentle pull and it will bring the panels together. Okay, so I have just finished my mattress stitch seam, and I have just stopped here at the 2 marked stitches, and I think it's looking really good. So if you look very closely, it's actually not that easy to tell where the seam is and where the stitches are, so I'm really happy with that. And now, because this is on the shoulders, we do want it to be a nice strong seam. So what I'm going to do is flip it over, and let's have a look at how the seam is looking on the wrong side, so on the inside of the sweater. And this is what it looks like. So to make this seam extra strong, I'm going to whip stitch all the way back along the seam to the very edge before I weave in my ends. So let's just do one more stitch just to secure the final bit of the mattress stitch seam. And then I'm going to start to whip stitch. And now, just because I find it easier to work from right to left, I'm just going to turn this around so that I'm going in this direction here. But this whip stitch is going to be super easy, and because we are working on the wrong side, we don't need to be too fussy about exactly how it looks. It's just here for reinforcement. Okay, so I'm just back at the opposite end of the seam. And now that is super duper strong and it's not going anywhere. So now all I need to do is just weave in this end, and I'm done with the first seam. And as you can see, I think I've just about one yarn chicken with this piece of yarn. Okay, so that is the first shoulder seam done, and I think it looks really good. I'm really happy with that. So I'm just going to go ahead and seam the other shoulder in exactly the same way, and then I will come back into the video just to show you how we're going to do the sleeve cuffs. And we're not going to seam the sides yet, so what we're going to do is just work the cuff for the sleeve into this edge here. And then we'll seam the sides and the sides of the sleeve all together. All right, so I'm going to get on with the seam, and I will see you back here for the sleeves. Alrighty, so I have finished my seaming, and now I'm ready to go on to the sleeve trim. So to start the sleeve trim, I am looking at the wrong side, so I'm looking at the seam, and I have also placed 2 stitch markers here to mark the even half double crochet rows that we worked just before we began the puff stitch section. So we'll mark the same place on each side, and that's going to be the width of our sleeve trim. So to get started on the sleeve trim, I am just going to insert my hook into the side of this first marked stitch, and pull up a loop. And now I am just going to single crochet evenly all along the side of the sleeve. So I'm going to chain one, single crochet in that first marked stitch, and then continue along. So what I'm going to do is work one single crochet for each half double crochet row, and then for the puff stitch rows I'm going to work 2 stitches for that. Now it doesn't really matter, to be honest, how you work this. The important thing is to just do it as evenly as you can and to end up with an even number of single crochet stitches at the end of the row. So to begin the row, I've just worked over the tail a little bit, but I'm going to stop doing that now because for garments especially, I prefer to weave in my ends properly at the end. So I'm just going to leave that out for now and continue single crocheting across. Okay, so I have finished working my single crochet row and just confirmed that I do have an even number of stitches. So for the size that I'm making here, I have 38 stitches. But to be honest, don't worry too much about exactly what you end up with, it just needs to be an even number. So let's continue with the trim. So I'm going to turn my work. And now I'm going to work the ribbing in exactly the same way as we did for the hem actually, but this time we're going to be joining the ribbing to this single crochet row and joining as we go. So I'm going to begin by chaining 9. And I'm just going to create a short sleeve trim here, but if you want to make the sleeve longer, you absolutely can. So you can make this chain as long or as short as you want. And if you decide that you want a full length sleeve, I was just trying the sweater on and see how many inches you need to take the sleeve length from this line here to the wrist. I'm guessing you're going to need around 6 or 7 inches of a chain depending on the length of your arm. But if you want to make a super long sleeve that you can fold over, you can absolutely do that too. So let's go ahead with my short sleeve here. So I'm going to skip the first chain and then do my yarn over slip stitch in the second chain from the hook, just like I did for the hem ribbing, and pull that through. Okay, I'm just going to turn this a little bit to make my life a small bit easier. And let's just continue along the chain, and we should have 8 yarn over slip stitches. All right, so that is our first ribbing row done. Now to join to this row of single crochets, I'm going to use a slip stitch, so just a regular slip stitch to join to this first single crochet. So that's one done. And then I'm going to do another single crochet, another slip stitch, sorry, in the next single crochet. So there's our second slip stitch. And that second slip stitch counts as a turning chain. So instead of a chain 1, we're just doing that joining slip stitch. So let's turn our work. And what we're going to do now is skip those 2 slip stitches, so we don't need to work into them. And then we're going to continue with our ribbing in each of the yarn over slip stitches. And as with the hem ribbing, working into the back loop. So we'll yarn over, skip the 2 slip stitches, and then yarn over slip stitch in the back loop all the way along. And if you're finding yourself a little bit unsure of which stitches to skip and which stitches to work into, counting your stitches is really going to solve all those issues. So we just need to make sure that on each row of the ribbing we have the same number of stitches. Okay, so we have 8 there. So let me just continue on with a few more rows of that. So we'll chain 1, turn our work, so let's just pause here for a second, because sometimes this last stitch can be a little tricky to find due to those slip stitches and having to turn. So because I have worked 7 yarn over slip stitches, I know that I need 1 more to complete my row. So I'm just going to use a pin here just to show you that back loop hiding down here. Okay, so that's the loop you need to work into. So if it is hiding, just count your stitches and make sure that you are working the correct number. So we'll just yarn over, insert our hook into that last back loop and complete the stitch. Okay, so the ribbing is starting to take shape and it'll become more obvious as we go along and work a few more rows. So now, next thing we need to do is join to the single crochet row again. So we're going to do a slip stitch in the next single crochet. So that's the joining stitch, and now we're going to do another slip stitch in the next single crochet, and that acts as our turning chain. And that's literally it for the ribbing. So we're just going to keep working our yarn over slip stitch rows and joining with the slip stitches when we come to that single crochet row. So again here, skipping the 2 slip stitches, so 1, 2, and continuing to yarn over slip stitch all the way along. So that's it. So I'm just going to keep going with the ribbing, and when we're done we can leave a nice long tail and use that for seaming the sleeves and the sides. Okay, so I have finished my sleeve trim and I have fastened off and left a nice long tail to seam the sides of the sweater. And just leave a tail as long as you think you'll need. So for me, I just measured out a length of yarn twice as long as the sides of the sweater, and I think that would be absolutely plenty. So for the sides, I'm not going to use the mattress stitch. I'm actually going to whip stitch on the wrong side of my work, and I just find this easier for seaming the edges of rows together. I find the mattress stitch not quite as easy for those, but honestly you can use whatever seaming method you like. So I'm just going to fold over my sweater to the wrong side. So before I start seaming, I'm actually just going to go and insert some stitch markers into the edges of the rows just to make sure that the seams are lining up exactly. So I'm going to find the point where I started the increasing every row, and then find the point where I started doing the double increases, and just mark them off on both panels to make sure that the seams are perfectly lined up. So this, you don't absolutely have to do this, but I just like to take this extra step just to make sure that my seam is looking really good. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so that's my stitch markers inserted. I'm actually going to do one more step, and I'm going to use these sewing clips just to clip the edges together. So if I'm seaming a small section, I don't do this usually, but if it's something a bit longer, like the size of the sweater, I do just like to take a few extra minutes to make sure that my seaming is going to be done properly. Because there is nothing worse than ripping out a seam. and we are all done. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this project and that you get as much wear out of your sweater as I am. And if you do have a second to like this video and subscribe, that would be absolutely amazing. And don't forget that I have lots more crochet patterns and tutorials here on my channel and on my website nedandmimi.com, so do check those out. Thank you so much for watching. Happy crocheting and take care.